Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today we welcome to the show Frank Knuettel. Frank is the CEO at Chromocell, where they're developing innovative, non-addictive alternatives to treat pain. Frank is a free market guy, and he loves being in the space of helping early stage companies to grow. Who Frank is to me is the phrase, a second mountain guy. David Brooks wrote the book, The Second Mountain, a few years ago, where he talks about this shift from a first mountain person, very focused on results and outcomes and external measures of success, and shifting to a second mountain where the focus is on people and process and impact. And so again, to me, Frank is a second mountain guy. He has become the kind of person who deeply cares about people, process, and impact. And you'll hear that in his desire for impact, both at Chromocell and in the life science market overall. You'll hear that throughout our conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Frank Knuettel. Frank Knuettel, welcome to the show. Excited to have you today.
It's a pleasure, Jeff, for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I just did a brief introduction of you and who you are to me. Would love for you to start us off and share what you're up to in the world.
Absolutely. So my wife and I moved back to New York with our family a couple of years ago. We're both from here and had the opportunity to take on Chromocell, as well as a bunch of other projects. One of the things that can be maddening about New York is its chaos and everything else, but at the same time, there's an abundance of opportunities here. And on top of the work we're doing at Chromocell, and I'm shepherding there, which we'll go into in a little bit more in a couple minutes, but there's just an abundant number of opportunities to help foster early stage companies. And frankly, that's my bailiwick, my background. I am sort of an expert in early stage growth companies, and that's what got me to Chromocell, as well as a number of other opportunities, most of which are in the life science sector at this point. Beyond that, we're loving living back in New York. Again, it's got to be something you love because it's got all the negatives of a big city and then some. But it's just fabulous. And our kids have all taken to New York in an unbelievably good way, despite having grown up in the West, largely in Denver, where we were the last 14 years. So all three of them have managed to become city people.
I joke people because so we're just across the river from each other. I'm in New Jersey, and people will ask that who aren't from here, well, do you go to New York? I said, as little as I can. Once in every couple of years, we'll put the family in the car and we'll either do the full drive or we'll go to a train station, take a train in. But I explain to people who aren't from here, this is where I live in New Jersey. It's like a different planet than New York City.
There's, having traveled a fair amount, there's very little like New York, certainly in the United States.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the United States like it. And it really is different than everything but a handful of cities around the world. Now, some of them, frankly, are even more chaotic. We recently came back from visiting our daughter, who's studying abroad in Japan. And it's a little weird to go on vacation to a city even more chaotic and frenetic than New York. But yeah, New York is a unique place. And frankly, you either love it and can deal with all of the problems, or frankly, you want to stay as far away as you can.
That's funny. So you described yourself there as an expert, I think that's the word you use, in early stage companies. And I'm curious, what is it kind of at the the cellular level of that environment that just makes you come alive?
I got an MBA, and I have a degree in finance and entrepreneurial management. And I may have been one of the few, and admittedly, this was 30 odd years ago, but I may have been one of the few people in my graduating class from grad school that did not go into investment banking or consulting. And for me, it was all about putting the pieces together and building a company. And one of the things I find really exciting about it is the flexibility to be involved in finance and strategy and business development and marketing. Because a small company, while you can wear a single proverbial hat, leadership is fairly small, and it requires a great deal of interaction with colleagues to set the path. And I considered large corporate life, but frankly, thought it might be a little stultifying for me. So the mixture of having an opportunity to be involved in all aspects of the business and build it from, in many respects, a clean sheet of paper is really exciting to me. That commitment and the opportunity to put something together, from building blocks.
And you're not native life science, and so I'm curious, why Chromocell and why now?
So, to your point, my early career was in tech, semiconductors and software primarily. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been doing more board work in the life science sector, and have gotten introduced to it through that board work. And the thing about life science or technology, when you're starting or early stage, it's very similar, right? You have an idea, you put a plan in place, and you drive towards that goal. And the end goal product is different, but the process is very similar. And for me, it was, I think, a natural evolution into this industry based on the board work I had been doing. And especially living on this side of the country, because I lived in California before Denver for 10 years. And in this side of the country is a little more life science focused. The other side of the country is a little more tech focused. And that's, that sort of demarcation is broken down. Google's moved into New York, and a whole bunch of other, West Coast tech companies have moved out here. And the opportunity to take advantage of what I learned as a board member in these life science companies, and take my learnings and experience in building companies, felt like the right opportunity or the right move for me to make. And this opportunity arose at Chromocell by virtue of some of the investors that I've done work with in the past. And they asked me if I would come in and frankly help steer the company. And that's what I did. And frankly, for me, it's it's a bit of a personal story, right? Non-opioid pain, and thankfully, it's not a tragic personal story, but it's a personal story. I've done a lot of bike racing over the years, and unfortunately, a bike race, you crash, broken a fair number of bones and such, and and surgeries to fix that, and they go on opioids, right? It's the standard post-surgical. And the last time I did that, within 36 or 48 hours, I was having hallucinations and all kinds of stuff. And I was able to get out of that without a problem, but it really brought home the consequences of opioid addiction, or the prospects of opioid addiction, and the need to find an alternate approach. So all these sort of things came together at the same time, and really fulminated in my joining Chromocell a little less than 2 years ago now.
And what are you I imagine a CEO, you have your hands in a lot of things, but what is it that you have your direct hands in right now, or in this season of time that has you most excited?
I would clue the strategic component of it. We have, in some respects, it's a curse. In some respects, it's a blessing. We have more projects than we have resources to pursue, both in capital and people. So working through the strategic plan, figuring out what those projects, which projects we should prioritize and which we should consider out licensing or joint venturing and entering into those conversations is the sort of the most exciting part of it. We're blessed to have a really good team of clinical folks led by Dr. Eric Lang, our chief medical officer, who spent 25 years developing drugs for pain treatment. So we've got a really good clinical and research group, and I have a lot of faith in Eric and his team. So we're very much partners in that regard, and he's a little more focused on the day-to-day clinical stuff, and I'm working on the strategic components and all the other aspects of developing our operating plan.
Mm. One of the questions that we love to ask for our guests is about who they've become. A quote that we love is by John Ruskin, that the greatest reward for your work is not what you get from it, but who you become by it or through it. I'm wondering, Frank, as you step back and reflect, who have you become?
It's a really interesting question, and I like to perhaps answer that in a way that may or may not be directly responsive. But earlier in my career and frankly my life, in my late 20s, there was a goal in building a company to sell it and make money. And a certain amount of aging and wisdom has brought me to the point where the building of the company is the fun part. It's the journey. And if you build the company well, the end goal will take care of itself. So I have become much more focused on the journey and the build than the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And part of that was, frankly, in the work I do, early stage, some work very well, some are disastrous. And you could have the best group of jockeys, the old saw in Silicon Valley is you bet on the jockey, not the horse. You can have the best group of jockeys, but economic turns or any of a host of different issues. I mean, you just have technical failures that weren't expected, and result in a negative outcome. So over time, I've learned that, frankly, it's the journey and the build that's more important than the pot of gold. And if you do a good job, maybe the pot of gold will come. So I've become, it's an interesting issue on wisdom and experience versus intelligence, right? It's great if you can have both. And there's certainly a lot of very young, talented, CEOs of companies who have wisdom beyond their years. But frankly, there's a certain amount of living gets you a level of wisdom that doesn't always exist. And, I think I've just become a wiser version of an earlier self, I guess is the best way to put it.
Mm. It's a journey that a becoming, to use that term, that I hear in a lot of people, and so that's common. But what is usually unique is that something in the person's story had to get deconstructed to make that shift. And I'm wondering, if thinking about your story, what had to be unpacked or deconstructed so that you could shift from that first mountain, to use the David Brooks analogy, the first mountain to the second mountain of the process?
Well, I'm generally an early stage guy, and a couple of those I've actually even co-founded. And one of my first companies in my mid-30s, where I actually founded the company. It ended up kind of a smoking hole in the ground. And I remember, meeting in a conference room at a local hotel with two of my co-founders, my only two co-founders, from day one, before we even had our investor commitment. And we literally had a laptop, right? And there was an idea in a laptop. And we pushed that all the way through, and frankly raised a fair amount of venture capital from some very high profile venture capitalists. Frankly, built a great product, but the industry turned. And this was back in this is basically the dot-com bust, and these were semiconductors for core routers, and the industry turned, and a whole bunch of management stuff went down, and some of my co-founders were pushed out, and it ended up being a very big emotional loss, for me. I mean, there was not a whole lot of financial impact, but from an emotional perspective, it was hugely cathartic to go through the process. High-profile VCs, really smart co-founders, frankly, a successful product, and still, because of the dot-com bust, it didn't make it. And I had been so wrapped up in that for so many years. I mean, we had, for a while, mandatory 6-day work weeks, and to get the project done, because it started falling behind as a tech, right? And when that didn't work out, it was a really big cathartic experience for me. And that, I think, set me on the journey that I am to now, where it's, the process is super valuable. I mean, there's an old Harry Chapin song, I think, Greyhound, I don't know the song, but it's all about the journey, not the getting. It's the getting, it's the journey getting there, not the getting there, that's most rewarding, or something along those lines. And that kind of espouses me. And, it took this very traumatic business event for me to sort of open up to that.
You're in a position, whether at Chromocell or on boards or as a dad, to influence younger people on this change of mind from being very performance or results oriented to more process and people oriented. I'm wondering, how do you impart that to folks? Sometimes they just have to have those cathartic experiences of their own. But how do you mentor and guide folks to see that way, maybe sooner than circumstance would dictate?
So there's sort of two parts to that. There's the being the father part, and then being the professional mentor part. If someone could explain to me how to do it as a father, great. My wife and I do our best, and frankly, our kids are all doing well, and they're starting to launch into the world. Prospects look good, but I do wonder how often they've actually listened to us. We're taking their guidance. Maybe in 10 or 15 years, they'll figure it out. I don't know. I've learned a lot in my life about either reading or talking to people who've been there before. And the one thing I've never been able to learn in advance is being a parent, right? Because even with my siblings and my wife and her siblings, all from the same environments, are all so dramatically different. And the imparting of wisdom on a child is something we strive to do, but I'm not, the proof's going to be in the pudding in some number of decades, I guess. On the corporate side, it's more, it seems to be a lot more straightforward. I'm on the board of a SPAC, and the CEO is a younger fellow. And he is just a tremendously smart, hardworking, and diligent guy. But he gets wound up at times, and he gets to me, he looks like I was when that company was that semiconductor company was not doing well. And in the SPAC world these days, the SPAC world has a lot of challenges, and so he's faced a lot of challenges. And I've actually found him very receptive to the mentorship and guidance, and he's learning enormously about his own management style, I think, through the imparting of what little wisdom I can share with him. So it seems more discreet and straightforward in a corporate environment, but it's actually I would not want to be a formal teacher, but I enjoy teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A mentor of mine said about parenting, when he went to someone and said, well, how do I know how I'm doing? And he said, well, check in around 20 years, but yeah, even do that very, very lightly. And I, to some degree as well, in the professional environment, I as a coach, bring my full self to my clients, as you do for those you're mentoring. And at the end of the day, it really is out of our hands.
Yeah, some regards. I'm sorry. Were you?
No, that's fine. Yeah. Just to shift gears slightly, because I think all of this is conversations life science leaders aren't having on most days. But just to put a fine point on it here at this stage of our conversation, when you hear me say that phrase, conversations life science leaders aren't having, what comes to mind?
So, having been involved in the life science sector directly or, as an investor or board member for 6, 7, 8 years now, and having been a student of the capital markets for 30 odd years, the thing that struck me the most, so there's been I don't use the word nuclear winter, but there's been a very definite downturn for the last 30 odd months in the life science sector, especially among the smaller caps, right? Some of the larger cap names have done well or very well, although even in that regard, some of the ones that ended up having a lot of success during the early stages of COVID have had COVID hangovers. And the thing that I've, over the last 30 months, it's really sort of struck out at me is that there's to use the film parlance, we're not sure what we lost on the cutting room floor, but there's been a lot of really good science that has not been funded. And there's some really good science, the large pharma companies, that is being put on the shelf because of competing priorities. And not generally a big fan of sort of government industrial programming. But the CHIPS Act, I think, had was particularly salient because of both national security and the concentration in chip manufacturing in a country in the shadow of China. And I don't know, what's going to happen there, but it seems to be one of those core industries where the American companies are very good at developing the IP and had been outsourcing the construction, and bringing it back on shore, I think, really valuable. And I say that as a stepping stone to a CHIPS Act for the life science industry. Certainly there's lots of government grants and whatnot, but it's complex and difficult, and frankly, there's oftentimes not enough money to actually make a difference. And if you look at one of the sectors where the United States is clearly a significant leader, is the life science sector. And so I worry about how much good science has been lost. And I think that something a little more like the cancer moonshot. I think that was a Biden initiative. But something like that more broadly for the industry. And in our sector in pain management, the default's still opioids. And for a long time before the opioid crisis came along, look, opioids work really well. Don't get me wrong. There's some pretty big negatives. And so they work really well. And, before the opioid crisis really became apparent, there was not a whole lot of alternate research. And I think, in areas like cancer or pain management or a number of other areas, there would be value in having some sort of a CHIPS Act for life science. And I don't speak to a lot of industry folks that seem all that focused on what happens with all that good science. So I think that's a pretty key area. And maybe it goes part and parcel with increase in STEM funding in the schools. But certainly I think, that's something I don't hear a lot about, and I think it's pretty important.
Mm. What's the role that you in particular as a CEO of a life science company, what's the role that you have in that conversation?
It's I think it's developing. I think I only recently sort of synthesized the whole idea in my head. And I haven't quite figured out yet what the action plan is, or how I might help with that. But so I think that's an open-ended item at this point, but it's clearly, I think, a critical issue that I want to think more about.
How do you, so bringing it just internally, a place where you can have influence, significant influence, how do you make sure good ideas get daylight and that they don't, whether, as you called it, go on the shelf or just go by the wayside completely? How do you make sure that good ideas see the sunshine?
Well, for us, as I mentioned at the top of our discussion, we have more programs than we have resources for. Mm-hmm. And part of what I enjoy most is the strategic component of thinking about how to allocate the resources to those programs or how to partner with others on those programs. So we have quite a bit of patent life left on our programs, and then we have, depending on the indication, maybe orphan designation extensions or patent term extensions, orphan designation exclusivity or patent term extensions. So, I don't want to put them on the shelf. I want to find, to the extent that we are not prioritizing them internally, I want to find a partner that will prioritize those, either because it fits into their portfolio or their resources or whatever, so that A, we have an economic benefit out of it, and B, the science gets to market. Because I do think in our field that pain management is definitely becoming more popular again. There are some companies in our industry that have had some successful recent readouts. We have good preclinical and phase 1 work behind us, and so for me at Chromocell, it's really making sure we either can fund it internally or we find a partner who can fund it to make sure the market gets to market, and we also would have an economic benefit for our shareholders.
Yeah, it feels like there's the spirit here of what you bring or what your team brings is, doesn't matter if we get credit, doesn't matter if there's a massive payout. This is a great idea, or at least a good idea, and let's find a way to bring it to the world, or at least move it along its life cycle so that it has a chance, rather than it getting shelved because of resources.
Yeah, I'm on the board of a different SPAC, and our target is a life science company. And some of the intricacies of de-SPACing may cause the project to go sideways. And, my first thought is, gosh, that's really we need to get this science to the market. And however we can facilitate it. If this doesn't work out, some other way, but, and this is phase 3. This is a phase 3 product. And look, it'll get fixed one way or the other, but it's not been easy. And it hurts me that this is not getting to the market sooner, or maybe at all, because of the benefits of the product to people, worldwide. So it's maybe it's another part of my evolution and aging and wisdom, but I've taken on the mission of trying to get some of these things to market for the value of helping people.
And one of the variables that is also at play that hinders, and from my seat, that hinders innovation is pricing controls. And so, you're a free market guy, and you're now in a space where this conversation, and not just conversation, but legislative measures are being taken to control prices.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how does that, for lack of a better way of saying it, sit with you, and how you see your job given this variable of price control?
Yeah, if I can make a funny juxtaposition at my own expense, I am generally a free market guy, but I also just talked about industrial policy, right? It's a struggle, because if you go back to economics 101, and you limit the ability to profit from something, you end up with less of it. And the current initiative targeting blockbuster drugs, I understand intellectually why it's being done. But the problem is those blockbuster drugs spin off a lot of cash that fund 99 other programs, of which a single-digit handful make it to the market. So if you limit the cash flow out of the blockbuster drugs, maybe instead of 99, it's only 50. And instead of only 4 or 5 successful, you only end up with 1 or 2. And that, is sort of the same issue that about what gets left on the floor or the shelf. You have a lot of really smart scientists out of universities and other firms that are constantly coming up with ideas. And the complexity of drug development is significant. The complexity of the human body system is significant. But you have all these really smart people coming up with ideas, and instead of 99 projects, you have 50, and 2 successes instead of 5, or whatever the number may be. That's a concern. We can't get away from the fact, the flip side, that U.S. drug pricing, U.S. drug costs are generally higher than the rest of the world, maybe in its entirety. And that causes all kinds of other societal issues. So, I don't have the answer necessarily. I've got some ideas. I don't think price controls are necessarily the best one. There's been a lot of effort to reform healthcare. One point as a free market guy that I wonder is why we have 50 independent markets in this country for health insurance, right? Why are there 50 CEOs of health insurance company A and 50 CEOs of health insurance company B, and all the administration that goes along with that? So perhaps, so I'm not a big fan of price controls, but perhaps reforming the health insurance business further than has already been tried might be an avenue that would help mitigate healthcare expenses. So I'm not a fan because I think it chokes off the resources for innovation. Now, if it were done in conjunction with a true CHIPS kind of act in the life science sector that was manageable, maybe that's an alternative. But as a standalone policy, I think price controls are problematic because it chokes off innovative funding.
And again, we're talking macro picture. I want to bring it for a moment back to your world, Chromocell, and we're talking about productivity. We're talking about innovation, risk-taking even. How do you cultivate those within your walls?
So by virtue of being a small company, the folks that are willing to take the leap into Chromocell or other similar organizations tend to have the entrepreneurial mindset. Much like when I was getting out of grad school and wanted to be in a company that builds things, the concept of going into a large corporate enterprise to me was anathema. So to some extent, I think it's self-selecting. And because someone who's built for a large corporate enterprise is probably not going to be comfortable with the risk in and of itself, as you pointed out. And so the risk is there, but the mindset of the folks who are willing to take it it's kind of already built in for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it doesn't take a whole lot of coaching, frankly, because of the self-selection nature of it.
That even feel there's an ease about that. I know there's a lot of unease because of the environment, but it's just even that to know this environment, and I have the people who at least mindset and skill set wise that I need to do what we need to do. That feels like there's a sigh of relief. I have the right people.
Yeah, we have a small team. Frankly, most of the work we do is outsourced to consultants or CROs. But our core team are folks that are all committed to the mission and have the mindset to deal with the ups and downs. If you're at a large pharma company, it's a little bit like an oil tanker versus a PT boat, for example. You cut the engines on an oil tanker and it'll go for 20 miles. You cut the engines on a Boston whaler, for example, and you're stopped in the water in 20 or 30 meters. And so the variability of being in a small company versus a large company is quite different. And we're fortunate that we have people who are okay with that mindset. Okay with the mindset that, in a small company, you have to wear a lot of hats. You have a lot of different responsibilities. Things arise all the time that will have a meaningful impact on us. Whereas on a larger company, it probably wouldn't be felt in most regards. I mean, clearly things happen, but the impact of exogenous events on a small company can be quite a bit more considerable. And we've got people who are comfortable and familiar with that profile.
Yeah, it takes, as you've pointed to throughout our conversation, takes a special mindset to be in this early stage environment. It's not for the faint of heart.
No, but at the same time, it's not, the opportunity, the excitement of doing it and the opportunity to change the world for even a select number of patients. And we're working on indications that are far more than a select number. Our eye program, for example, would have, I mean, just for example, there's 5 million corneal abrasions in the United States every year. So some of our programs are dedicated to programs with millions and millions and millions of prospective patients. So the opportunity to work in an environment where we might be able to change the lives of those people is something that is far surpasses in my mind the variability of being in a small company.
Frank, as we move to the end of our conversation, I'm going to give you the magic wand. And with the wave of this wand, you get to plant the seed of a conversation every life science CEO across the globe is going to have over the next 2 weeks. What's that conversation that you want them to have?
Well, that's a stymieing one. I think that as I consider over the next couple of weeks, being the perspective, as the markets turn down again, hopefully it's short-lived. I guess what I'm hopeful for that everyone thinks about is not losing more, right? The Dow is down 1,500, 1,800 points in the last 5 trading days. And while the Dow is not a perfect indicator, it does flow downhill, if you will. And I'm constantly worried and becoming more worried that you will have the situation where more science is going to be lost. And I don't think people are thinking about that enough. There's one of the arguments about burning down the rainforest is what do we lose in biodiversity? And one of the arguments is what do we lose in potential drug candidates? And there just doesn't seem to be enough of that. And if the market does turn down, the GDP was revised downward, interest rates are high, markets are falling. I worry about losing more. Now, we're very fortunate that we have a very committed group of investors and have the resources to pursue some of our projects to the end. But it's just a general worry. I'm worried about losing more, outside of our company.
Yeah, I hear you. Frank, what would you love to highlight about Chromocell here as we wrap our conversation?
So I think we've touched on it in bits and pieces throughout, but I think that it's, we're really excited to be doing the work we're doing. I think our science is really good. I think we're in a very opportunistic time because, there's a long layoff, if you will, in investing in new pain treatment therapies. And I think we're hitting it at the right time. And so I think we've got a number of really high profile programs that I think will help, the treatment of a whole bunch of different indications of pain in a manner that's not addictive. And I think that's our central goal. And I think the underlying science and team are good. And I'm really excited about the journey.
If folks want to know more about you or about Chromocell, where can we send them?
So our website is www.chromocell.com. On there, we have an investor portal as well that you can sign up for access or news feeds and pushes on company information, SEC filings, press releases, and such. So there's information on the website itself, and you can sign up for the push so you can get constant news feeds.
Great. Well, we'll put that in the show notes so that folks can find that easily. Frank, this has been a lot of fun. Really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.